10 years is a long time to carry a memory, but sometimes the person who changed your life does not even remember your name. The autumn sunlight reflected off the glass walls of the federal building in downtown Richmond, Virginia, painting the sidewalk with bright streaks of gold as hundreds of workers moved through the busy morning rush. Among them walked Darius Coleman, a 38-year-old man whose calm presence rarely attracted attention. Dressed in a tailored navy suit and carrying a simple leather briefcase, he blended naturally into the crowd of attorneys, analysts, and government employees entering the building. His expression was focused but relaxed. To everyone around him, it looked like another ordinary workday. But only a few minutes later, that ordinary morning would collide with a chapter of his life he had not revisited in years. Across the street, Officer Ryan Mitchell stepped out of his patrol vehicle and scanned the area. At 45 years old, Ryan was a veteran officer who trusted his instincts almost as much as he trusted procedure. Years on the job had taught him to observe details quickly, and sometimes that confidence pushed him toward conclusions before all the facts were visible. As he watched pedestrians crossing toward the federal complex, his attention settled on Darius. Something about the man caught his eye. Perhaps it was the expensive suit. Perhaps it was the calm confidence with which he moved. Or perhaps it was simply one of those moments when a person becomes the focus of another person's assumptions. Ryan started walking toward him. The sounds of traffic echoed between the buildings while a cool breeze carried fallen leaves across the concrete plaza. Darius continued toward the entrance without noticing the officer approaching from behind. "Sir, hold up for a second," Ryan called out. Several people nearby glanced over before continuing on their way. Darius stopped and turned politely. His face remained composed. Ryan stepped closer and asked a series of questions about where he was going and why he was entering the building. The questions themselves were not unusual. The tone behind them was what changed the atmosphere. People entering the building began slowing down. Some watched discreetly. Others openly stared. Darius answered respectfully, but Ryan continued pressing. The officer's confidence grew with each passing moment, convinced he had identified someone who did not belong. Darius listened carefully. Then something unexpected happened. The moment he looked directly into Ryan's face, a memory surfaced. Not a vague impression. Not uncertainty. Recognition. The officer standing in front of him was older now. His hair carried traces of gray, and time had added new lines around his eyes. Yet Darius knew that face. He knew it instantly. 10 years earlier, that same officer had stood over him on the worst day of his young adulthood. For a brief moment, memories flashed through his mind like sunlight reflecting off broken glass. The embarrassment, the confusion, the feeling of being judged before anyone knew the truth. Darius felt the past brush against the present, but he showed none of it on his face. Ryan continued speaking, completely unaware. He did not recognize the man standing before him. He did not realize that history had just placed them on the same sidewalk again. And as the crowd slowly gathered around the growing tension outside the federal building, neither man knew that the next few minutes would change both of their lives for a second time. Darius Coleman kept his expression calm even as old memories continued surfacing beneath the surface. The federal building towered behind him, its glass exterior reflecting the movement of the busy Richmond morning. Government employees streamed through the entrance carrying coffee cups, briefcases, and laptops. Most barely noticed the interaction taking place on the sidewalk. Others slowed down just enough to observe before moving on. To them, it looked like a routine police encounter. To Darius, it felt like history quietly repeating itself. Ryan Mitchell continued asking questions, completely unaware that the man standing before him already knew exactly who he was. Darius answered politely and carefully. His voice remained steady. Years of discipline had taught him the value of patience. Yet while Ryan focused on the present, Darius found himself drifting briefly into the past. 10 years earlier, he had been 28 years old, carrying textbooks instead of a briefcase. Back then, his life looked very different. He was finishing graduate school while working nights to help support his family. Money was limited. Opportunities were uncertain. Every day felt like a race against obstacles that seemed larger than he was. Still, he carried a stubborn belief that hard work could eventually create a better future. Then one afternoon, everything changed. A misunderstanding placed him in the middle of a situation he never should have been part of. Before he could fully explain himself, Assumptions filled the empty spaces where facts should have been. The experience lasted only a short period of time, but its emotional impact remained far longer. For weeks afterward, he replayed the event repeatedly. The embarrassment stayed with him. The feeling of being judged before being understood stayed with him. Most of all, he remembered the face of the officer who never truly looked at him as an individual. Standing outside the federal building now, Darius realized he was looking at that same face again. Time had changed both men, yet the memory remained clear. Ironically, the experience that once caused so much frustration had eventually become one of the most important turning points of his life. Instead of allowing bitterness to consume him, Darius had transformed the experience into motivation. He became determined to understand the justice system from the inside. He wanted to become the kind of professional who sought facts before conclusions. The road was not easy. Years of study followed. Long nights, competitive training programs, countless sacrifices. There were moments when success seemed impossibly far away, but each challenge strengthened his resolve. Eventually, his persistence opened doors that once felt unreachable. Today, he walked into federal buildings not as a visitor seeking opportunity, but as someone entrusted with responsibility. Yet despite everything he had accomplished, he rarely spoke about the event that helped shape his journey. It was part of his history, not his identity. Ryan interrupted his thoughts by asking another question. Darius returned his attention to the present. The officer's tone remained skeptical. Around them, the morning crowd continued moving through the plaza beneath the bright autumn sunlight. Leaves drifted across the concrete as a cool breeze passed between the surrounding buildings. Darius noticed that Ryan still had not recognized him. There was something strangely revealing about that fact. One man remembered the encounter because it had changed his life. The other had forgotten it entirely. As the conversation continued, Darius quietly wondered what would happen if Ryan ever realized who was standing in front of him. For now, he remained patient. The truth had a way of revealing itself when the time was right. Ryan Mitchell shifted his stance and glanced toward the federal building entrance as more employees streamed through the revolving doors. The steady flow of people seemed to irritate him rather than reassure him. In his mind, something about Darius Coleman still did not fit the picture he had already constructed. The officer had spent years relying on instincts developed during countless shifts, and that confidence often served him well. Today, however, it was quietly steering him toward a conclusion he had not yet earned. Darius stood patiently beneath the bright autumn sunlight, his briefcase resting comfortably at his side. He answered every question respectfully, offering neither resistance nor frustration. Yet the more composed he remained, the more unsettled Ryan seemed to become. Around them, the plaza had developed an invisible circle of attention. People walking past slowed briefly before continuing toward the building. Some exchanged curious glances. Others pretended not to watch while clearly listening. The interaction was becoming increasingly public. Ryan asked where Darius worked. Darius provided a simple answer. Ryan asked another question, then another. Each response came calmly. Each answer remained professional. Yet Ryan continued searching for something that would confirm the suspicion growing in his mind. Darius noticed the pattern immediately. He had seen it before. Sometimes people stopped looking for truth once they became convinced they had already found it. The realization did not make him angry. It made him reflective. Standing there, he could not help noticing how similar the moment felt to the one that had happened a decade earlier. Different location, different stage of life, same underlying assumptions. A gust of wind carried several orange leaves across the concrete plaza. The federal building reflected the morning sky like a wall of blue glass. Darius briefly looked toward the entrance. Beyond those doors waited meetings, reports, and responsibilities that had taken years of effort to earn. Every achievement represented countless sacrifices, long nights studying, intensive training programs, missed holidays, career decisions that demanded discipline when easier paths existed. None of those accomplishments had appeared overnight. Yet standing here now, none of them were visible to the people watching. All they could see was a man being questioned on a sidewalk. Ryan folded his arms and studied him. There was something strangely familiar about Darius, though he could not identify why. The feeling lingered at the edge of his memory before slipping away again. 10 years had changed both men. Time had softened details while preserving only fragments. For Ryan, The old encounter had become one forgotten moment among thousands. For Darius, it had become a turning point. The contrast carried its own quiet lesson. People rarely remember the moments when they hold power over others. The people affected by those moments often remember them forever. A pair of federal employees passed nearby carrying folders and coffee cups. One of them glanced toward Darius with concern before entering the building. Ryan noticed and straightened slightly, aware that more eyes were watching now. The pressure of public attention began influencing the encounter. He felt increasingly determined to justify his actions. Darius sensed it too. The situation was no longer about gathering information. It was becoming about proving a point. Yet despite everything, Darius remained calm. He knew something Ryan did not. The truth was already present. It did not need defending. It only needed time. And as the morning sunlight continued illuminating the busy plaza, that moment of truth moved steadily closer, waiting just beyond the next question. The tension on the plaza continued building almost invisibly, like pressure gathering beneath the surface of calm water. Ryan Mitchell remained convinced that something about the situation deserved further scrutiny. The more people passed through the federal building entrance, the more determined he became to justify the attention he had placed on Darius Coleman. Around them, the steady rhythm of downtown Richmond continued. Cars rolled through nearby intersections. The sound of distant sirens drifted between office towers. Coffee vendors greeted customers beginning their workday. Yet inside the small circle formed by the encounter, time seemed to move differently. Darius stood quietly beneath the bright autumn sky, showing a level of patience that surprised even some of the people watching. Most individuals would have become visibly frustrated by now. Some might have argued. Others might have walked away. Darius didn't either. He simply answered questions and allowed the situation to unfold. His calmness carried a quiet strength that was difficult to ignore. Ryan asked him to provide identification. Darius nodded respectfully and reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. Several nearby pedestrians slowed their pace again. The movement immediately drew attention. Ryan watched closely. Years of training made him focus on details, but now another emotion had begun mixing with professional caution. Pride. He had invested so much confidence in his assumptions that stepping back no longer felt easy. Darius withdrew a slim leather credential holder and held it calmly in one hand. For a brief second, neither man moved. Sunlight reflected from the glass walls behind them and illuminated the dark leather surface. Ryan extended his hand and accepted it. The crowd continued moving around them, unaware that the next few moments would completely transform the encounter. Darius observed Ryan carefully. He could almost see the process unfolding behind the officer's eyes. First came routine attention, then concentration, then confusion. Ryan opened the credential holder and stared down at its contents. His expression changed immediately. The certainty that had carried him through the entire interaction seemed to pause. His eyes moved across the identification once. Then again, the noise of the city suddenly felt distant. Federal Bureau of Investigation. The words were impossible to misunderstand. Ryan looked up quickly, then back down, then up again. Darius remained calm. His face revealed nothing beyond quiet composure. Around them, several observers noticed the sudden shift in Ryan's demeanor. They could not see the identification itself, but they could see the effect it was having. The officer's posture changed. His confidence gave way to uncertainty. For the first time that morning, he appeared to be questioning his own conclusions. Then something even more unexpected happened. Ryan's eyes settled on the name printed beside the photograph. Darius Coleman. The name triggered something buried deep within memory. A face from long ago. A report. A young graduate student. A moment he had not thought about in years. Ryan stared at Darius as fragments of the past began reconnecting inside his mind. The realization arrived slowly at first. Then all at once. The sidewalk. The federal building. The crowd. Everything seemed to fade into the background. He knew that name. More importantly, he knew that face. Older now. More confident. More accomplished. But unmistakably the same person. 10 years earlier, their lives had crossed under very different circumstances. Ryan felt the memory returning with uncomfortable clarity. Darius saw the exact moment recognition appeared. He did not smile. He did not speak. He simply waited. The truth that had remained hidden throughout the morning was finally revealing itself. And for the first time since the encounter began, Ryan Mitchell found himself standing face to face not with a stranger, but with his own past. For several long seconds, Ryan Mitchell could not look away from the credential in his hands. The federal identification seemed heavier now than when he first opened it. The name remained exactly where it had always been, yet everything about it felt different. Darius Coleman. The realization continued spreading through his thoughts like ripples across still water. He remembered the younger version of that face. He remembered a nervous graduate student trying to explain himself. He remembered assumptions that had seemed reasonable at the time. Most of all, he remembered how quickly he had reached conclusions before fully understanding the situation. The memory returned with a clarity he had not expected. 10 years had passed, but standing on the plaza outside the federal building, it suddenly felt much closer. Around them, the city continued moving at its normal pace. Office workers crossed intersections. Buses stopped and started. The sounds of traffic echoed through downtown Richmond. Yet inside Ryan's mind, everything slowed. He looked up from the credential and met Darius's eyes. For the first time since the encounter began, he truly saw the man standing before him. Not simply a stranger in a suit. Not a person who attracted suspicion for reasons he could no longer justify. He saw an accomplished professional whose journey had continued long after their paths first crossed. Darius remained calm. There was no anger in his expression, no satisfaction, no desire to embarrass the officer who was finally beginning to understand what was happening. That composure somehow made the moment more difficult. Ryan had spent much of the morning operating from certainty. Now certainty had vanished. In its place stood uncomfortable self-reflection. The crowd that had formed around the interaction began sensing the shift. They could not hear every word, but they could see the change in body language. The officer who had controlled the conversation minutes earlier now appeared unsettled. The man being questioned remained composed. Ryan handed the credential back carefully. His movements lacked the confidence that had defined them before. Darius accepted it and slipped it back inside his jacket. The autumn sunlight reflected softly across the glass walls behind them. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Ryan asked a question that surprised even himself. He quietly asked whether they had met before. Darius studied him for a second. The answer was obvious now. Ryan's expression already revealed that he knew. Still, Darius offered a simple response. He reminded Ryan of a day 10 years earlier when a graduate student found himself caught in a misunderstanding that changed the course of his life. The words landed with quiet force. Ryan lowered his eyes briefly. The memory was complete now. He remembered the location. He remembered the report. He remembered the young man standing before him. What he had never known was everything that happened afterward. Looking at Darius now, he understood that the story had continued long after he stopped thinking about it. For Darius, that difficult day became motivation. For Ryan, it became a forgotten file. The contrast settled heavily between them. Nearby pedestrians continued entering the federal building beneath the bright morning sky. Some glanced over curiously before moving on. Others never noticed the significance of what was unfolding. But for the two men standing on that sidewalk, the moment carried tremendous weight. One had spent 10 years building a future beyond a painful memory. The other was just beginning to understand the lasting impact of a moment he had long ago left behind. And as the sunlight illuminated the plaza around them, Ryan found himself confronting a realization far more powerful than the FBI credential he had just seen. He was confronting the consequences of assumptions that had followed someone else's life long after they disappeared from his own. The plaza seemed quieter now, even though hundreds of people continued moving through it. Ryan Mitchell stood beneath the bright autumn sunlight, carrying a weight that had nothing to do with his uniform and everything to do with reflection. The realization of who Darius Coleman had become continued settling into place. Yet what affected him even more was understanding who Darius had been when their paths first crossed. For years, Ryan had viewed that old incident as a routine part of the job. It occupied no special place in his memory. There had been countless reports, countless interactions, countless shifts. But standing outside the federal building, he suddenly understood that some moments carried different meanings for different people. What felt ordinary to one person could become life-changing for another. Darius noticed the shift occurring inside the officer. The tension that had defined the morning was fading, replaced by something quieter and more honest. Reflection. The federal building rose behind them like a wall of glass and steel, reflecting the blue Virginia sky. Sunlight shimmered across its surface while pedestrians continued entering through the revolving doors. The world had not stopped. Yet for both men, time felt slower. Ryan looked toward the sidewalk for a moment before speaking again. His voice carried none of the confidence that had dominated the earlier conversation. Instead, there was uncertainty. He admitted that he barely remembered the details of what happened 10 years ago. Saying the words aloud seemed to pain him. Darius nodded. He had expected that answer. The truth was not surprising. People rarely remembered every moment when they held authority. They remembered the major events in their own lives. The people on the receiving end often remembered much more. A cool breeze drifted through the plaza, carrying a swirl of orange and red leaves across the concrete. Darius watched them roll past before speaking quietly. He explained that the experience had been difficult, but it was not the reason he stood here today. The reason he stood here was what happened afterward. He made a decision. He chose not to let frustration define him. He chose not to spend years angry at a moment he could no longer change. Instead, he focused on becoming the kind of person capable of creating positive change himself. Ryan listened carefully. Every sentence seemed to challenge assumptions he had never examined. Darius explained how he returned to school with even greater determination. He studied harder. He trained harder. He became obsessed with understanding justice, responsibility, and service from every angle possible. The road eventually led him into federal service. Not because he wanted power, not because he wanted revenge, because he wanted to ensure that decisions were guided by facts rather than assumptions. The words hung in the air between them. Ryan felt something inside him shift. He had expected resentment. He had expected criticism. What he found instead was perspective. Darius was not standing there as a victim reliving old pain. He was standing there as a man who had transformed adversity into purpose. The realization humbled him. Around them, the morning sunlight continued illuminating the plaza. Reflections danced across the building's windows. The city moved forward as always. Yet within that ordinary moment, something important had changed. One man was revisiting his past. The other was demonstrating what it looked like to rise above it. And standing together beneath the clear autumn sky, both understood that the most powerful victories were often the ones achieved quietly, years after the original battle had ended. Ryan Mitchell stood motionless for several moments after Darius finished speaking. The sounds of downtown Richmond continued all around them, yet the conversation seemed to exist in its own quiet space separate from everything else. Cars passed through intersections. Business professionals crossed the plaza carrying laptops and coffee cups. The revolving doors of the federal building spun continuously as employees arrived for another ordinary workday. But for Ryan, the morning had become anything but ordinary. He looked at Darius differently now. The FBI credential had revealed one truth. The story behind it revealed something far more significant. Darius had not simply succeeded. He had transformed a painful experience into a purpose-driven life. Ryan found himself wondering how many people would have responded the same way. Most individuals carried disappointment for years. Some carried resentment. Others allowed difficult moments to define their identity. Yet standing before him was a man who had chosen a completely different path. The realization was humbling. Darius adjusted his grip on the briefcase and glanced briefly toward the federal building entrance. His meeting time was approaching, but he remained patient. He could see that Ryan was processing more than just the facts of the situation. The officer was confronting a deeper truth about influence and responsibility. Sometimes people never discovered how their actions affected others. Today, Ryan was being given that opportunity. A cool breeze moved across the plaza, carrying another wave of autumn leaves between the glass buildings. Sunlight reflected from the federal building's windows and illuminated the sidewalk around them. The brightness seemed symbolic somehow. What had remained hidden all morning was finally becoming visible. Ryan looked down for a moment before asking a question he had not expected to ask. He wanted to know why Darius remembered the incident so clearly. The answer came without hesitation. Darius explained that the day itself was important, but not for the reason most people would assume. He remembered it because it forced him to make a choice. He could spend years proving people wrong, or he could spend years becoming the person he wanted to be. That choice changed everything. Ryan listened carefully. Then came a revelation he never saw coming. Darius smiled faintly and admitted that, in an unexpected way, the experience had helped shape his future. Not because it was fair, not because it was pleasant, but because it challenged him to rise above circumstances he could not control. The word struck Ryan with surprising force. He had expected blame. Instead, he was hearing gratitude mixed with perspective. Darius explained that every major achievement in his career traced back to one decision made after that difficult day. The decision to focus on growth rather than bitterness. The decision to build rather than break. The decision to move forward. Ryan felt the full weight of the moment settle over him. The story he had created in his mind throughout the morning was completely wrong. He believed he was evaluating a stranger. In reality, he was standing before a man whose strength had been forged through challenges Ryan never fully understood. Around them, pedestrians continued moving through the plaza without realizing the significance of the conversation unfolding nearby. Yet for the two men standing beneath the bright Virginia sky, everything had changed. Darius had revealed the second truth hidden inside the encounter. The difficult experience 10 years earlier was not merely something he survived. It became one of the reasons he achieved extraordinary success. Ryan found himself speechless. The young graduate student he once underestimated had become a respected federal agent. And perhaps even more remarkable, he had done so without allowing the past to harden his heart. Standing there in the autumn sunlight, Ryan realized he was witnessing a kind of strength far greater than authority. He was witnessing character. Ryan Mitchell stood silently for a moment, looking at the man in front of him as though he were seeing him clearly for the first time all day. The confidence that had once driven every question had disappeared completely. In its place stood humility. The autumn sunlight continued spilling across the Federal Plaza, casting long reflections across the polished glass walls behind them. The crowd that had briefly gathered earlier had mostly moved on. The city had returned to its normal rhythm, but something important remained unfinished between the two men. Ryan took a slow breath and finally spoke. His voice was quieter than before. He admitted that he owed Darius an apology, not only for the assumptions he made that morning, but for the assumptions he carried 10 years earlier. The words were not polished. They were not rehearsed. They were honest. Darius listened without interruption. He could see how difficult the moment was for Ryan. Some apologies came easily because they cost nothing. Others required a person to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves. This was the second kind. Ryan explained that when he looked back now, he realized how often people in positions of authority could forget the lasting effect of their actions. He admitted that he never imagined their encounter from years ago had remained with Darius for so long. He never considered that a brief interaction from his perspective might become a defining memory for someone else. The realization weighed heavily on him. Darius remained calm as he listened. Then he offered a response. Ryan would remember for the rest of his life. He told him that carrying resentment would have been the easiest choice. Anger often felt justified. Bitterness sometimes felt deserved. But neither one helped build a future. Darius explained that eventually he realized something important. He could spend years focused on the people who underestimated him, or he could spend those same years investing in himself. The second path was harder, but it produced a better destination. Ryan lowered his eyes briefly. Those words struck deeper than any criticism ever could. Darius was not standing there trying to win an argument. He was sharing a lesson earned through experience. The federal building reflected the bright sky above them as a gentle breeze drifted through the plaza. A few leaves rolled across the sidewalk before settling near a row of planters. The moment felt strangely peaceful. Ryan thanked Darius for his honesty. More importantly, he thanked him for his grace. He admitted that if their positions had been reversed, he was not sure he would have handled the situation with the same level of dignity. Darius smiled slightly. The expression carried warmth rather than triumph. He told Ryan that everyone made mistakes. What mattered was whether they learned from them. Growth was impossible without reflection. Accountability was impossible without humility. Ryan nodded slowly. For the first time that morning, the tension was completely gone. What remained was understanding. Two men who once stood on opposite sides of a painful memory now stood on common ground. The years between them suddenly felt less important than the lesson before them. As sunlight illuminated the plaza and the city continued moving around them, Ryan realized that Darius had given him something far more valuable than forgiveness. He had given him an opportunity to become better than he was the day before. For a few seconds, neither man spoke. The conversation had reached a place where words seemed less important than understanding. The morning sun continued shining across the Federal Plaza, turning the glass walls of the building into mirrors that reflected the bright Virginia sky. Around them, the flow of people never stopped. Employees entered through the revolving doors. Visitors crossed the sidewalks. Cars moved steadily through nearby intersections. Life continued exactly as it had before. Yet for Ryan Mitchell and Darius Coleman, something fundamental had changed. Ryan extended his hand. The gesture was simple, but it carried the weight of everything that had happened. Darius looked at it for a moment before accepting it. Their handshake lasted only a second, but it closed a chapter that had remained unfinished for 10 years. Ryan thanked him again, this time not only for the conversation, but for the example he had set. Darius nodded. He understood that growth often began with uncomfortable moments. The important thing was what a person chose to do afterward. A nearby clock tower marked the passing hour. Darius glanced toward the Federal Building entrance. He had responsibilities waiting for him inside. Reports to review, meetings to attend, decisions that would affect people he might never meet. The work mattered. Ryan noticed the glance and stepped aside. There was no longer any barrier between Darius and where he needed to be. There was only respect. As Darius started walking toward the entrance, Ryan called out one final time. Darius turned. The officer stood quietly beneath the autumn sunlight, looking more reflective than he had at any point during the morning. Ryan told him that he hoped their next meeting would happen under better circumstances. A faint smile appeared on Darius's face. He said he hoped so too. Then he continued toward the building. The distance between them slowly increased. Ryan remained where he was, watching. He saw the confidence in Darius's stride. He saw the security personnel greet him with professional familiarity. He saw the doors open automatically as Darius approached. None of those details impressed him as much as the journey behind them. 10 years earlier, he had seen a young man standing at the beginning of his future. Today, he had witnessed the result of perseverance, discipline, and character. Darius stepped through the entrance and disappeared into the building. The glass doors closed softly behind him. Ryan stood alone for a moment longer. The breeze carried a few final leaves across the plaza. He looked down the sidewalk where the encounter had begun and reflected on everything he had learned in the span of a single morning. Authority mattered. Experience mattered. Training mattered. But none of those things mattered more than seeing people clearly before judging them. With that thought, Ryan turned and began walking back toward his patrol vehicle. The city continued moving around him. The sunlight remained bright. The streets remained busy. Yet he carried something new with him now. Not guilt. Not shame. Perspective. And somewhere beyond the glass walls of the Federal Building, Darius Coleman continued forward with the same quiet determination that had carried him through every challenge life placed in his path. The morning ended not with triumph or defeat, but with something far more lasting. Understanding. Beneath the clear autumn sky, two lives that once collided through misunderstanding separated again, this time with mutual respect. And in the silence that followed, the strongest voice belonged to the lesson neither man would ever forget.